Is salvation a promise or a prison? What if the path to heaven felt more like a slow, quiet descent into a life you never truly chose? For women in medieval Europe, roughly between the 5th and 15th centuries, becoming a nun was often presented as a divine calling, a sacred escape from the perils of the secular world. But peel back the layers of stained glass windows and whispered prayers, and a different story emerges. A story of profound human struggle, where the very act of devotion carried an emotional cost that would echo through the quiet halls of the cloister. Number 10. Fear of damnation and pressure to conform. In the flickering candlelight of the convent scriptorium, a nun, perhaps Sister Eleanor, would trace the delicate lines of a sacred text. Her fingers, often stiff from the cold and the endless hours of copying, moved with a practiced rhythm. Beneath the calm surface of her work, a deep tremor could often settle within her soul. This was the medieval world, a place where the air vibrated with tales of miracles and damnation. Teachings of the Church were not merely doctrines, they were the very framework of existence, shaping every thought, every aspiration, every quiet fear. The fear of eternal punishment, of the torment of hellfire, was not some distant concept for medieval people. It was a tangible, ever-present threat, vividly depicted in church murals, in the sermons delivered by visiting priests, and in the very scriptures they devoted their lives to. For a nun who had chosen a path of heightened piety, the stakes felt even higher. She was, in the eyes of God and her community, meant to be a beacon of virtue, a perfect bride of Christ. This expectation was a heavy mantle, pressing down on her shoulders with the weight of her immortal soul. Imagine the sermons delivered within the chapter house. The booming voice of a visiting friar describing in gruesome detail the fiery pits, the wailing souls, the endless suffering that awaited the wicked. These were not abstract warnings. They were terrifying prophecies, meant to instill deep, abiding fear. A nun living a life of supposed purity would internalize these messages with an intensity that outsiders could barely fathom. Every small misstep, every impure thought, every moment of doubt could feel like a dangerous slip towards the abyss. Records from the time, like the penitential books used by confessors, showed the meticulous scrutiny applied to spiritual life. These were not just for criminals, they were guides for confessors, to assess the sins of ordinary people, and especially those dedicated to religious life. A nun would be expected to examine her conscience constantly, to root out even the tiniest seeds of pride, envy, or sloth. The self-examination could be relentless. Did she truly love God with all her heart? Or was there a flicker of resentment towards her abbess, a moment of vanity admiring her own neat handwriting? These seemingly minor infractions in the context of eternal salvation took on monumental significance. The pressure to conform was relentless. The rule of Saint Benedict, the most common guide for monastic life, emphasized obedience above all else. Obedience to the abbess, to the rules, to God. Any deviation was not just a breach of discipline. It was a spiritual failing. If a nun was seen to be lazy or rebellious, or even simply less devout than her sisters, she faced not just earthly penance, but the terrifying prospect of divine displeasure. Communal life meant that any transgression, however small, was visible. A sister might notice a nun arriving late for matins, or singing off-key during lauds, or showing a flicker of impatience during work in the garden. These observations, often reported to the abbess, would lead to public humiliation, stricter penances, or even solitary confinement. Consider the internal monologue of a nun lying awake in her cold cell in the dead of night. Had her prayers been heartfelt enough today? Had she truly embraced the silence? Or had her mind wandered to a memory of home? Had she truly surrendered her will? Or was there still a stubborn kernel of her old self, clinging to desires she had vowed to renounce? Each question, each doubt, became a small, gnawing fear. The fear that she was failing, that she was not worthy, that despite all her sacrifices, she was still on the path to damnation. Historians studying medieval spirituality often note the deep anxiety surrounding personal salvation. This anxiety was amplified within the cloister, where the very purpose of existence was to achieve spiritual perfection. The stories of saints, often read aloud during meals or in chapter meetings, presented an almost impossible standard. Saints endured torture, performed miracles, lived lives of perfect charity and unwavering faith. How could a simple nun, battling the gnawing hunger of a fast day or the ache in her knees from hours of kneeling, ever hope to measure up? The gap between the ideal and the reality could feel vast and terrifying. Sometimes, the pressure manifested in extreme self-punishment. While not universally practiced, some nuns, driven by intense fear of sin and a desire to atone, would engage in flagellation, self-starvation, or other forms of mortification of the flesh. These acts were not merely expressions of piety. They were often born from a deep-seated terror of spiritual impurity, a desperate attempt to purge any lingering sin and ensure their place in heaven. It was a tangible manifestation of the crushing weight of expectation. The knowledge that the smallest misstep could lead to eternal suffering created an environment of constant self-scrutiny and fear. A nun might meticulously confess her sins, even the most minute, to her confessor, seeking absolution only to immediately begin worrying that she had forgotten something or that her repentance was not sincere enough. This cycle of fear, confession, and renewed fear could be utterly exhausting, turning every day into a perilous journey across a spiritual tightrope with a terrifying chasm of damnation always looming below. Quiet of the cloister, far from being a peaceful sanctuary, could become an echoing chamber for these profound internal fears. Number 9. Loss of identity and individuality. When a young woman crossed the threshold of the convent, leaving behind the bustling world outside, she began a transformation that went far beyond shedding her secular garments. This was not just a change of address. It was a profound, systematic dismantling of her individual identity. Records from medieval convents often speak of the clothing ceremony, a pivotal moment where a novice formally became a nun. This ceremony was packed with symbolism, each gesture designed to convey the complete surrender of her former self. First, her secular name was often stripped away. Eleanor might become Sister Agnes, or Sister Benedicta, or Sister Mary. This renaming was not arbitrary. It symbolized her new spiritual identity, her rebirth into Christ. It was a deliberate act of disconnection from her family lineage, her childhood nicknames, the personal associations that had defined her for years. When she heard her new name, it might have felt foreign on the tongue of her sisters, a constant reminder that the person she once was no more. Then came the habit. The simple, often coarse wool or linen garments, usually in somber colors like black, white, or gray, were a uniform. No personal adornment, no colorful ribbons, no fashionable embroidery. The habit was designed to be simple, practical, and utterly indistinguishable from those of her sisters. It erased any outward sign of personal taste or social standing. The high-born noblewoman and the humble peasant's daughter wore the exact same cloth, same cut, same simple veil. This physical sameness was a powerful visual message. Here you are all equal in God's eyes, and equally stripped of your former selves. Tonsure, the shaving or cutting of a small patch of her hair, was another symbolic act of renunciation. In a time when hair was often a significant part of a woman's beauty and identity, this act signified a complete break from secular vanity and feminine allure. Her head, now partially shorn or simply covered by her veil, was no longer her own. It belonged to God, and her appearance was no longer for the eyes of the world. It was a public and private statement that she was no longer of the world, but set apart. Beyond the outward symbols, the daily life within the convent further eroded individuality. The monastic rules, like those of Saint Benedict, prescribed every aspect of life. Nuns woke at the same hour, ate the same food, performed the same tasks, prayed the same prayers in the same postures at the same times. There was little to no room for personal preferences or expressions of individuality. If a nun had a particular talent for singing, she might be encouraged to join the choir, but even then, her voice was meant to blend achy with the others, not to stand out. If she had a quick wit, it was to be subdued by the rule of silence and humility. Consider the loss of personal space. Cells were often small and sparsely furnished, sometimes shared with other sisters. There was no personal property to speak of. Everything belonged to the community. This communal ownership extended even to books, tools, and sometimes clothing. A nun could not simply retreat to her room to pursue a personal hobby or read a book of her own choosing. Every activity was communal, every moment observed. This constant proximity, while intended to foster community, could also be suffocating for an individual seeking even a moment of private contemplation or creative expression. Records show that even within monastic orders there were women of incredible intellect and artistic talent, like Hildegard of Bingen, who composed music, wrote theological treatises, and even advised emperors. But Hildegard was an exception, often battling against the constraints of her time and order to express her unique gifts. For the vast majority of nuns, such individual expression was discouraged, if not outright forbidden. The goal was conformity, not distinction. The focus on humility was paramount. Nuns were taught to humble themselves, to see themselves as servants, to avoid pride and self-importance. This meant that any personal achievement or intellectual pursuit that might lead to praise or recognition was to be downplayed or attributed solely to God's grace. If a nun had a unique insight during a discussion of Scripture, she was to offer it humbly, perhaps even prefacing it with an apology for speaking. The suppression of ego was a constant internal battle. Think about the silence. Monasteries often observed strict rules of silence for long periods of the day. During meals in the cloisters, even in their cells, conversation was often forbidden or restricted to absolute necessities. While intended to foster contemplation, this lack of conversational interaction also stripped away a key way humans define themselves and connect with others, through sharing thoughts, opinions, and personal stories. Without the opportunity for spontaneous dialogue, the nuances of individual personality could fade. For a young woman, perhaps one with a lively spirit or a deeply introspective nature, this systematic erasing of self could be profoundly disorienting. She was meant to become a blank slate upon which God's will could be written. But the human desire for self-expression and recognition does not simply vanish. It might manifest in subtle ways, a slightly different way of knotting her wimple, a hidden small trinket, or simply a deep, quiet yearning for the person she once was, a person who had a name, a unique face, and a voice that was truly her own. Constant pressure to conform, to blend in, to become just another identical figure in the procession of veiled women, was a slow, quiet erosion of the very essence of who she was. Number 8. Boredom and monotony. The medieval convent, for all its spiritual purpose, was also a place of crushing monotony. The rhythm of daily life was meticulously prescribed, each hour accounted for, each activity repetitive. For a woman entering the cloister, especially one from a more varied secular background, the sheer lack of novelty could be a profound emotional burden. The days bled into one another, each one a near perfect replica of the last, stretching out into an endless procession of identical hours. Core of monastic life was the liturgy of the hours, the cycle of prayers chanted at specific times throughout the day and night. From the pre-dawn darkness of matins, often beginning around 2 or 3 a.m., through lauds at sunrise, prime terce, sext nun, vespers, and finally compline before bedtime, the bells tolled, summoning the nuns to the choir stalls. They would stand, kneel, sit, and sing the same psalms, the same hymns, the same prayers, day after day, week after week, year after year. The words, initially perhaps deeply moving, could become rote, a meaningless drone of syllables performed out of duty rather than genuine devotion. Imagine the long stretches of silence. The rule of silence was often observed during meals, during much of the work periods, and certainly during the long hours in their cells. While intended for contemplation, this silence also meant a lack of stimulating conversation, a dearth of new ideas or perspectives. The world outside the cloister was dynamic, filled with news of harvests, battles, marriages, and births. Inside, the world shrunk to the confines of the convent walls, and the topics of conversation were limited to the practicalities of convent life or spiritual matters. There was little to spark curiosity or engage the mind beyond the prescribed texts. The work performed by nuns, while essential, was often highly repetitive. In many convents, this meant copying manuscripts by hand in the scriptorium, hour after hour, day after day, tracing the same letters, forming the same illuminated initials, copying the same theological treatises or biblical passages. The work demanded intense focus, but it offered little variation. Other tasks like weaving, spinning, mending habits, gardening, or preparing simple meals also followed predictable patterns. There was no room for innovation, no sudden challenges, no exciting new projects. Tasks were an endless cycle of maintenance, simply keeping the convent running. Records sometimes hint at the desire for stimulation. Some convents had larger libraries offering more diverse reading materials, but access was often restricted, and the content was largely religious. For a nun with an active mind, or one who had been educated before entering the cloister, the lack of intellectual challenge could be particularly stifling. There were no debates on current events, no plays, no new scientific discoveries to ponder. The intellectual landscape was largely static, defined by centuries-old theological texts. Consider the meals. The diet was simple, often meager and highly repetitive. Bread, ale, or water, vegetables from the convent garden. Perhaps some cheese or fish on certain days. Meat was often forbidden. The flavors were bland, the textures familiar. There was no anticipation of a novel dish, no special treat to look forward to. Even the act of eating became another predictable, unvarying ritual, often observed in silence. The physical environment itself contributed to the monotony. High walls, narrow cloisters, simple stone chapels, small, sparsely furnished cells. The views were often limited to an enclosed garden or another part of the convent complex. There was no changing scenery, no new sights to behold. The outside world was a distant blur, glimpsed only rarely and often through heavily barred windows or from supervised parlors. This unchanging environment could feel like a perpetual still life, devoid of surprise or visual stimulation. Historians who examine monastic regulations note the strict controls on idle chatter or frivolous activity. While intended to foster spiritual focus, these rules also inadvertently stifled spontaneity and simple human enjoyment. There were few opportunities for laughter, for play, for light-hearted conversation. The atmosphere was one of solemnity and purpose, leaving little room for the kind of small, unexpected joys that break up the monotony of daily life in the secular world. For a nun, perhaps one who had once loved to dance or tell stories or explore the woods near her childhood home, this endless cycle of sameness could feel like a slow, quiet suffocation of the spirit. Her mind, craving stimulation, might drift during prayer, find itself counting the stones in the wall, or fixating on a dust mote dancing in a beam of sunlight. The smallest deviations from the norm, a bird singing a new tune outside the window, a different cloud formation in the sky, a rare visitor to the parlor, might become disproportionately significant simply because they offered a fleeting moment of difference in a world otherwise defined by unchanging, predictable repetition. The boredom was not just a feeling of being unengaged. It was a profound sense of temporal stagnation, a feeling that time itself had ceased to move forward, stuck in an eternal, unchanging present. Number 7. Envy and resentment. Beneath the pious veneer of communal living and shared spiritual goals, the medieval convent was still a human institution, populated by individuals with their own desires, frustrations, and ingrained human frailties. Even amidst vows of humility and charity, feelings of envy and resentment could simmer, creating subtle, often unspoken tensions that ate away at the serenity of the cloister. Hierarchy was a fundamental aspect of convent life. The abbess held ultimate authority, followed by the prioress, sub-prioress, and other officials who managed various aspects of the community. These positions carried privileges: a slightly larger cell, perhaps a window that offered a glimpse of the outside world, access to better food, or more comfortable seating during chapter meetings. For a nun who spent her days toiling in the laundry or copying manuscripts in a cold scriptorium, the sight of the abbess enjoying a somewhat warmer cell or being served a slightly better portion of food could breed quiet resentment. Consider the allocation of duties. Some tasks were more desirable than others. Working in the infirmary, caring for the sick, might be seen as a holy duty, but it could also be physically demanding and emotionally draining. Copying manuscripts required education and patience, and could be a solitary, often tedious task. Working in the kitchen or laundry was often back-breaking manual labor. If one nun was consistently assigned more pleasant or less demanding duties, or if she was seen as more favored by the abbess, whispers could begin. Sister Agnes might inwardly grumble that Sister Benedicta always seemed to be given the easier tasks, the ones that kept her hands clean and her back straight, even though they entered the convent at the same time and took the same vows. External contact, though rare, also fueled resentment. When family members visited, they often brought small gifts: a fresh piece of fruit, a new roll of parchment, or a small indulgence. These visits and the accompanying gifts were often privileges tied to the nun's family's social status or generosity to the convent. A nun whose family never visited, or who brought nothing but sparse conversation, might feel a sharp pang of envy as she watched another sister receive a parcel from her kin, a tangible link to the outside world she had left behind. Records show that even within the monastic ideal, worldly connections often subtly persisted, creating an informal pecking order based on who had important family on the outside. Then there was the spiritual envy. Some nuns seemed to achieve a state of spiritual ecstasy, experiencing visions or profound mystical connections with God, as documented in the lives of figures like Mechthild of Magdeburg or Bridget of Sweden. These experiences were often highly prized and could lead to a nun being seen as particularly blessed or holy. For other nuns, who diligently performed their duties, prayed faithfully, but never experienced such divine favors, a quiet bitterness could set in. Why was God so generous with one sister and so seemingly distant from another? Was their faith less strong, their prayers less sincere? This internal questioning could morph into resentment towards those who appeared to have an easier, more direct path to spiritual grace. Cloistered environment, by its very nature, was fertile ground for such feelings. With limited outlets for personal expression or external stimulation, small grievances could fester. A sharp word from a sister, a perceived slight during a communal meal, a sense of being overlooked or undervalued during a chapter meeting. These minor incidents amplified by the constant proximity and lack of external distraction, could take on disproportionate significance. The very vows of poverty and humility, while noble in intent, could sometimes be twisted into resentment when one nun felt another was not truly living up to them, or was somehow gaining an unfair advantage. Resentment could also be directed outward, towards the secular world. While nuns had chosen a spiritual path, it was often a choice made under duress or family pressure. They knew of the lives their cousins, sisters, or former friends led, lives of marriage, children, property, and freedom. The sound of distant wedding bells or the sight of a bustling market town from a convent window could trigger a sharp, unspoken pang of longing and bitterness. They had given up everything, supposedly for a higher purpose, but were the pleasures of the world truly so fleeting and sinful? This internal conflict could manifest as resentment towards those who had not made such sacrifices, those who seemed to enjoy the very things she had been forced to renounce. A nun might, in her private moments, wrestle with these unholy feelings of envy and resentment. She would pray for their removal, confess them as sins, strive for perfect charity. But human nature is complex, and in the confined, repetitive, and often unrewarding world of the medieval convent, these emotions were persistent, often unspoken burdens that weighed on the soul, undermining the very peace and spiritual harmony they were meant to cultivate. Quiet tension in the refectory, the averted glances in the cloister, the faint whispers after compline, these were the subtle, pervasive signs of human frailties battling against the lofty ideals of monastic life. Number 6. Spiritual doubt and despair. For a woman who had dedicated her entire existence to God, who had renounced the world for the promise of salvation, spiritual doubt was perhaps the most insidious and terrifying emotional toll. It was a gnawing internal struggle that undermined the very foundation of her chosen life, turning her sacred vows into a source of profound torment. In an era where faith was the bedrock of society, where the afterlife was a palpable reality, a crisis of faith was not merely an intellectual quandary. It was a desperate battle for the soul. The constant pressure to maintain an unwavering devotion was immense. From the earliest hours of matins to the final prayers of compline, every moment of a nun's day was structured around spiritual practice. She was expected to pray, to meditate, to contemplate the divine. But what happened when the prayers felt empty, when the words became just sounds, devoid of meaning? What happened when the promised comfort of God felt absent, leaving only a hollow silence? This was the spiritual dryness, a state described by mystics but experienced by many as a painful void. The harder she tried, the more distant God seemed, leading to a desperate sense of futility. Consider the teachings of sin and damnation. Nuns were constantly reminded of their inherent sinfulness, of the need for constant vigilance against temptation. They heard stories of how easily one could fall from grace, how subtle temptations could lead to mortal sin. The fear of eternal punishment, already present in daily life, intensified within the cloister. Every impure thought, every moment of weakness, every flicker of pride or disobedience could feel like a step closer to the abyss. A nun might meticulously confess her sins to her confessor, seeking absolution only to be plagued by the thought that she had not confessed everything, or that her repentance was not truly sincere. This cycle of self-scrutiny and anxiety could be relentless, preventing any genuine spiritual peace. The lives of the saints, often read aloud and held up as exemplars, also contributed to this burden. Figures like Saint Catherine of Siena or Saint Teresa of Avila experienced profound visions, ecstasies, and direct communion with God. For the average nun, whose spiritual life consisted mostly of tedious prayer and physical discomfort, these stories could create a sense of inadequacy. Why was God so generous with some souls and so seemingly silent to others? Was she unworthy? Was her faith too weak? This comparison could lead to profound feelings of failure and unworthiness, undermining her sense of her own spiritual journey. Sometimes, the doubt was not about her own worthiness, but about the very nature of God or the efficacy of her life. What if, despite all her sacrifices, despite renouncing the world, she was still not drawing closer to God? What if her prayers were never truly heard? What if the intense suffering she endured, the physical hardships and emotional isolation, were meaningless? This kind of existential doubt could be agonizing, turning the very purpose of her life into a source of despair. It was a terrifying thought that could not easily be shared, as doubt itself was often seen as a sin, a lack of faith. Records, though sparse, sometimes hint at spiritual crises within convents. There are accounts of nuns who struggled with despair, who questioned their vocation, or who even exhibited signs of what might today be recognized as severe depression or anxiety, often interpreted through a spiritual lens as demonic temptation or a trial from God. Some nuns might develop obsessive rituals, endlessly repeating prayers or penances, driven by a desperate need to feel certain of their salvation, to quiet the gnawing fear of inadequacy. The spiritual director or confessor, while meant to offer guidance, could also inadvertently contribute to the pressure. Their role was to push the nun towards greater piety, greater self-abnegation. If a nun expressed doubt or struggled with her faith, she might be told to pray harder, to fast more strictly, to impose greater penances upon herself, rather than receiving comfort or understanding. This could deepen her sense of failure, making her believe that her struggles were a sign of her own spiritual weakness rather than a normal human experience. In the quiet solitude of her cell, or during the long silent hours in the choir, a nun might wrestle with these tormenting thoughts. The overwhelming silence could amplify her internal anxieties. She might look at the crucifix, at the image of Christ's suffering, and feel a profound disconnect. She was meant to feel solace, to feel closeness, but sometimes all she felt was emptiness, a crushing weight of uncertainty. This internal battle, fought in the deep recesses of her soul, was a heavy and continuous emotional toll, capable of draining all joy and purpose from a life meant to be dedicated to divine love. Terror of failing God, of losing her immortal soul, was a constant shadow, long after the bells of Compline had rung and the last candle had been extinguished. Number 5. Physical hardship and asceticism. Life in the medieval convent was not a soft existence of quiet contemplation in warmth and comfort. It was a rigorous, often physically demanding, and intentionally austere life designed to mortify the flesh and elevate the spirit. This constant physical hardship, while lauded as a path to holiness, exerted a relentless emotional toll, wearing down the body and by extension the mind. The discomfort was not accidental. It was a deliberate practice of asceticism, meant to draw the soul closer to God through self-denial. Consider the climate within the convent walls. In winter, cells were often unheated or had only minimal warmth from a distant communal fireplace. Nuns slept on simple, hard beds, sometimes just straw pallets on the floor, covered by rough blankets. The stone walls of the cloister and chapel retained the biting cold. Hands and feet would ache with perpetual chill. During long hours of prayer in the choir, kneeling on cold stone floors for extended periods, the stiffness and pain in knees and backs would become a constant companion. In summer, the heavy woolen habits, worn year-round, would be stifling the heat, oppressive in the enclosed spaces. There was no escaping the extremes of the seasons, no modern comforts to alleviate the physical discomfort. The diet was deliberately meager and often bland. Meat was typically forbidden. except for the very sick or on rare feast days. Meals consisted primarily of bread, vegetables, beans, perhaps some cheese or fish, and water or weak ale. Fasts were frequent and strict, especially during Lent, when nuns might eat only one simple meal a day, often without dairy or other rich foods. The constant, low-level hunger, the gnawing emptiness in the stomach, was a familiar sensation. This chronic undernourishment, combined with physical labor, could lead to weakness, fatigue, and increased susceptibility to illness. It was a perpetual state of hunger, not acute starvation, but a persistent lack that drained energy and focus. The clothing itself was part of the hardship. The rough woolen habits, often made from unbleached wool, could be itchy and uncomfortable against the skin. Underneath, some nuns might wear hair shirts or other forms of penitential garments designed to cause constant irritation. These were not worn for comfort, but to remind the wearer of their sinfulness and to offer a continuous small suffering as penance. The daily dressing and undressing involved this persistent, low-grade physical discomfort. Work was often physical and repetitive. Nuns engaged in gardening, cooking, cleaning, laundry, weaving, and spinning. These tasks were necessary for the convent's self-sufficiency, but involved long hours of standing, bending, scrubbing, and lifting. Hands would become chapped, calloused, and often raw from work. The weariness in the muscles, the ache in the joints, was a persistent reality. There was no leisure class of nuns, no servants to perform the most demanding tasks. Every able-bodied sister contributed to the daily labor. Illness was common, and medical care was primitive. Without modern medicines or understanding of hygiene, diseases spread easily in communal living. A simple cold could turn into a severe cough. A cut could become infected. Nuns endured fevers, aches, and pains with little relief. The infirmary was a basic space, often with few comforts, and those who nursed the sick faced the constant presence of suffering and death. The idea was that suffering united one with Christ, but the reality was often prolonged physical distress. This pervasive physical discomfort had a profound emotional impact. A body constantly aching, cold, or hungry cannot easily achieve spiritual lightness or profound contemplation. The mind, instead of soaring in prayer, might be distracted by the gnawing hunger in the stomach, the stiffness in the knees, the itch of the habit. Constant weariness made it harder to focus, to maintain cheerfulness, to resist irritability. The very tools meant to elevate the spirit, fasting, long vigils, physical labor, could inadvertently become sources of constant frustration and exhaustion. Records from various convents like those associated with the Cluniac reforms or the Cistercian orders emphasize the strictness of these rules. While some convents might have been more lenient, the general trend was towards austerity. The emotional toll of this relentless physical strain was perhaps not something medieval people explicitly named. They simply accepted it as part of their sacred duty. But for the woman living it, day after day, year after year, it was a heavy burden. The body, constantly denied and pushed, became a source of perpetual low-grade distress, impacting her mood, her patience, and her capacity for joy. The physical pain was a constant, unspoken companion, echoing through the quiet cloisters, a testament to a life chosen for profound spiritual commitment, but lived in profound physical deprivation. Number 4. Rigid daily routine and lack of personal freedom. The life of a medieval nun was defined by an unyielding schedule, a horarium that dictated every minute from the deep hours before dawn until the final prayers of night. This extreme rigidity, coupled with an almost complete absence of personal freedom, was a profound emotional toll, turning daily existence into a carefully choreographed series of duties with little room for individual expression or spontaneity. The rhythm began before the sun. The first bell for matins would clang through the cold dormitory, often as early as 2 a.m. or 3 a.m. Nuns would rise, dress in the dark, and make their way to the chapel for the longest office of the day, hours of chanting, psalms, and readings. This was not a choice, it was a mandatory summoning. Every single day, there was no sleeping in, no slow awakening. The body had to obey the bell, regardless of fatigue or illness. After matins and lauds, there would be a brief period for personal prayer or study. Then the morning offices of prime and terce. Then the chapter meeting where nuns gathered to discuss convent business, receive instructions from the abbess, and confess minor faults. Meals were eaten in silence, often with a spiritual reading occurring simultaneously. Work periods followed, where nuns performed their assigned tasks, copying manuscripts, tending the garden, cooking, mending. More offices followed: sex nun, vespers, and finally compline, before a return to the dormitory for an early bedtime, only to begin the cycle anew just a few short hours later. Every action, every moment was prescribed. The rule of Saint Benedict, the most common monastic rule, left little to chance. Nuns were told when to wake, when to sleep, what to eat, when to pray, what to wear, and often even how to think. There was no concept of free time in the modern sense. Even periods of silence or individual contemplation were framed within the overall structure, understood as part of their spiritual duties rather than moments of personal leisure. Consider the utter lack of spontaneity. A nun could not decide to take a walk in the woods, or visit a friend, or pursue a new hobby, or simply spend an afternoon reading a book of her own choosing. Every hour had its purpose, every movement its place. If a nun had a sudden urge to write a poem, or sketch a design, or simply sit quietly and think, she would have to suppress it, or fit it into the narrow confines of her free spiritual reflection time, which was often consumed by prescribed prayers. The absence of personal possessions further reinforced this lack of freedom. Nuns typically took a vow of poverty, meaning all their possessions were given to the convent. They had no personal property, no private clothing, no books of their own choosing. This meant there were no personal items to cherish, no small comforts that might represent a connection to their past or a unique aspect of their personality. Convent provided what was deemed necessary, and nothing more. Records from medieval convents, such as account books or disciplinary registers, often detail minor infractions. A nun speaking when silence was enjoined, arriving late for an office, complaining about food, or possessing a forbidden personal item. These infractions, though seemingly small, were seen as breaches of obedience to the rule and to God. Punishments could range from public penance during a meal to stricter fasts or even temporary removal from communal life. The constant surveillance, the ever-present knowledge that any deviation from the prescribed path would be noted and corrected, created an atmosphere of constant self-censorship. The emotional toll of this relentless routine was profound. It could lead to a feeling of being a cog in a machine, a programmed automaton rather than a living, breathing individual. The spirit, craving variety and self-determination, would find itself constantly thwarted. There was no room for individual quirks, for creative impulses, for the simple human desire to make a choice. This persistent lack of agency, this constant submission to an external unchanging schedule, could lead to a deep-seated weariness that went beyond physical fatigue. It was a weariness of the spirit, a sense of being trapped in an endless, unvarying loop, where every day was exactly like the last, and every hour dictated by the tolling of a bell. The very concept of personal time, of making one's own decisions, was a luxury denied, creating a subtle but profound sense of confinement that stretched across a lifetime. Number 3. Isolation and separation from family and the secular world. When a medieval woman became a nun, she did not merely change her address. she underwent a profound separation from the world she had known, a severance from family, friends, and the familiar rhythms of secular life. This isolation, enforced by high walls and strict rules, was a profound emotional toll, creating a chasm between the nun and the world she had left behind. The cloister, a physical barrier, symbolized this separation. High walls, often topped with broken glass or thorny bushes, surrounded the convent. Gates were kept locked, and access was severely restricted. For the vast majority of nuns, leaving the convent was an extraordinary event, permitted only for severe illness to attend a funeral of a close relative, and even then, often with chaperones and swift return, or for specific rare convent business like collecting alms or visiting another monastery. Even then, strict rules often governed their conduct outside the walls, ensuring minimal interaction with the world. Contact with family was severely limited. Visits were infrequent, often supervised by the abbess or another nun, and conducted in a specific parlor area, often with a grill or barrier separating the nun from her visitors. Conversations were typically brief and constrained, avoiding worldly gossip or emotional displays. Letters were rare and often scrutinized, ensuring they contained no illicit news or complaints about convent life. News from home, of births, deaths, marriages, or illnesses, would often arrive late, if at all filtered and impersonal. A nun might hear of a parent's death months after it occurred, unable to offer comfort or attend the funeral. This meant a profound detachment from the lives of her loved ones. Children she might have had before entering the convent, or nieces and nephews she had seen grow, would become distant figures, their lives moving forward without her. The faces of her family, the sounds of their voices, the details of their daily existence would gradually fade into memory, replaced by the unchanging faces and routines of her sisters. The initial pain of separation might be sharp, but it was followed by a slow, quiet ache of being forgotten, of becoming an irrelevant presence in the lives of those she once held dear. The loss of connection extended beyond family. The convent was a self-contained world. Nuns had no friends outside its walls, no opportunity to meet new people or engage in social interactions beyond the strict confines of the community. They were cut off from the local village life, the markets, the festivals, the communal gatherings that formed the fabric of medieval society. News of wars, plagues, political changes, or even simple local events would reach them in a distorted, delayed, or superficial manner, emphasizing their detachment from the larger world. Records, though not explicitly detailing emotional struggles, infer this isolation through the strictness of their regulations. The Cistercian rule, for example, was particularly harsh regarding contact with the outside. The aim was to ensure absolute devotion to God, free from worldly distractions. But the human heart craves connection, familiarity, and a sense of belonging to a wider community. This fundamental human need was systematically denied. For a young woman, perhaps sent to the convent against her will or at a very young age, this enforced isolation could be particularly cruel. She had no say in her separation, and no means of escape or return. Cloister became not just a physical barrier, but an emotional one, trapping her within a small, predictable world while the vibrant, messy, unpredictable secular world continued its existence without her. The emotional toll of this isolation was complex. It was a constant longing for the familiar, a quiet ache for the faces and voices that were no longer present. It was the feeling of being a ghost in her own former life, a silent observer of a world she could no longer truly touch. The silence of the convent intended for contemplation could also become an echoing chamber for loneliness. Even surrounded by other nuns, the enforced separation from one's personal history and external connections could lead to a profound sense of solitude, a feeling of being utterly alone in a world that had moved on without her. The high walls did not just keep the world out, they kept the nun in a life of often profound and unyielding emotional solitude. Number 2. forced celibacy, and repression of natural desires. The very core of a medieval nun's vows was the commitment to chastity, a complete renunciation of marriage, sexual intimacy, and the possibility of motherhood. For a woman entering the cloister, whether as a young girl or in later life, this vow represented a profound and often lifelong suppression of fundamental human desires, leading to significant emotional tolls. The expectation was absolute. From the moment a novice took her final vows, she became a bride of Christ, symbolically wedded to God. This meant no earthly husband, no physical affection, no children. For a young woman reaching adolescence, experiencing the natural stirrings of desire, or one who had perhaps entertained thoughts of marriage and family before her entry, this vow was a constant internal battle. The body itself, with its natural urges and biological rhythms, became a site of spiritual conflict. The rules governing this vow were strict and pervasive. Nuns often slept in communal dormitories or small, unheated cells, but always separately, with no physical contact permitted. Any form of physical intimacy, even innocent touch, was strictly forbidden. The spiritual teachings emphasized the sinfulness of the flesh, urging nuns to sublimate their desires into pure devotion to God. This meant that any flicker of longing, any dream of tenderness or connection, was to be immediately identified as a temptation and ruthlessly suppressed through prayer, penance, or hard work. Imagine a nun, perhaps one who had seen her younger sisters marry and have children, observing the cycles of life from within her cloister. The sound of a baby crying in the nearby village, the sight of a family walking together, the quiet observation of life continuing outside the walls could trigger profound feelings of longing. The societal expectation for women in the medieval period was overwhelmingly to marry and bear children, to continue the family line and ensure salvation through procreation. To deny this path was to step outside the expected social role, and while spiritually elevated, it was also profoundly counter-instinctive for many. Historians studying the lives of medieval women often note the psychological impact of such repression. While some women undoubtedly found genuine spiritual fulfillment in celibacy, for others, it was a source of constant frustration and emotional pain. The longing for intimacy, for physical connection, for the warmth of another human being does not simply vanish because a vow has been taken. It can linger, manifesting as a deep loneliness, a sense of unfulfilled desire, or even as unspoken resentment. Records from the time, including ecclesiastical court documents, occasionally reveal instances where nuns broke their vows, sometimes secretly having relationships or even children. These instances were severely punished, often with excommunication or prolonged incarceration. The very existence of such cases, despite the extreme consequences, highlights the immense difficulties some women faced in maintaining such a demanding vow and the intensity of the desires they were forced to repress. Constant fear of discovery, the shame, and the spiritual burden of breaking such a solemn vow would have been immense. The emotional toll was not just about the absence of physical intimacy. It was also about the absence of partnership, of co-parenting, of the unique bond formed within a marital relationship. It was about the loss of the potential for a family of one's own, the natural progression of life that most women experience. The emotional energy that might have gone into forming these bonds had to be redirected entirely towards God, a demanding and often abstract love. For a nun, every day was a reminder of what she had given up. The feeling of her empty arms, the silence where children's laughter might have been, the coldness of her solitary bed, these were not mere physical sensations, but deep emotional pangs. The constant internal discipline required to suppress these fundamental urges, to deny the body's natural inclinations, was an exhausting and often lonely battle, fought within the confines of her own mind and spirit. It was a profound emotional sacrifice, a daily quiet struggle against the very essence of human nature, leaving a persistent ache for what could never be. Number 1. Loss of agency and autonomy. The moment a medieval woman entered the convent, she surrendered an almost complete degree of personal agency and autonomy, a profound emotional toll that reshaped her entire existence. This was not merely a change of lifestyle. It was a relinquishing of control over her own destiny, often decided by others and sealed by vows that were considered irrevocable. For many women, the decision to enter a convent was not their own. Girls, sometimes as young as 7 or 8, were placed in monasteries by their families. Reasons varied. A family might have too many daughters and insufficient dowries for suitable marriages. Thus, a convent offered a respectable alternative. Could be a way to avoid dividing inheritances among too many children, or to secure prayers for the family's salvation. For noble families, placing a daughter in a prestigious convent could even elevate social status and secure political alliances. The girl herself, especially if very young, had no say in this monumental life decision. She was simply delivered to the convent gates, her future already determined. Upon entering, a woman immediately lost control over her possessions. She might bring a dowry to the convent, lands, money, or goods, but these became the property of the community, not hers. Any personal items she owned were relinquished, her body and spirit now belonging solely to God and the monastic order. The vow of poverty meant she would own nothing personally for the rest of her life. She could not buy, sell, or even hold property. This economic dependence completed the stripping away of her autonomy. The daily routine, as detailed previously, was entirely dictated by the rule and the abbess. There were no personal choices about what to eat, when to sleep, what tasks to perform, or how to spend her time. Even her thoughts and spiritual inclinations were subject to scrutiny and direction. The abbess held immense power, not just over the practicalities of daily life, but over the very spiritual path of each nun. Every decision from the grand to the mundane was made for her or overseen by authority. Consider the rules of obedience. The rule of Saint Benedict emphasized unquestioning obedience to the abbess, who was seen as representing Christ himself. This meant that a nun was expected to obey without hesitation or argument, even if the command seemed difficult, illogical, or personally distasteful. This constant submission of one's will, the suppression of one's own judgment or desires, was a continuous emotional exercise. To voice dissent, to question authority, was considered a grievous fault, a challenge to the entire spiritual structure. Historians who have studied monastic records sometimes uncover instances of resistance, of nuns who struggled against the confines of their roles. These instances were rare and often met with severe discipline, reinforcing the idea that individual will had no place in the cloister. The system was designed to create uniformity, to eliminate personal agency in favor of collective devotion. The very choice of her new name, the cutting of her hair, the wearing of a uniform habit, all these acts, performed at the moment of her profession, underscored the complete relinquishing of her former self. She was no longer daughter of so-and-so, with her own ambitions and dreams. She was now Sister New Name, a member of a collective, her identity subsumed into the community. This process was meant to be spiritually liberating, freeing her from worldly attachments, but for many it was a profound loss of self. The emotional toll of this loss of agency was complex and pervasive. It was the feeling of being utterly powerless, of having no voice in her own life. It was the quiet resentment of being a pawn in family strategies, or a vessel for another's spiritual aspirations. It was the constant suppression of her own desires, her own judgment, her own personality. Over years, this could lead to a profound sense of resignation, a spirit broken by the relentless denial of self. The convent, while a spiritual sanctuary, was for many a gilded cage, where the price of salvation was the profound and irrevocable surrender of one's very self. The silence of the cloister, often seen as peaceful, could become the echoing silence of a life where one's own will had ceased to exist.